commercial farmers. And the concepts I will cover would be government agricultural subsidies. These are farm subsidies. Look at the Farm Bill. Look at the United States farm crisis that occurred in the 1980s. What is a commodity crop and what are commodity chains? What's sustainable agriculture, ridge tillage, and organic agriculture. So looking at the challenges for commercial farmers. Basically, the challenge is that they produce too many crops. They produce too many crops, and this is because they have new improved ways of farm production, new seeds, high-yield seeds or genetically modified seeds that would allow them to grow a lot more food, faster, hardier, resistant to pests and such. Fertilizer use with petroleum fertilizers made from petroleum products, synthetic fertilizers. We have a lot of access to fertilizers which help crops to grow, and pesticides, taking care of the bugs that are eating the plants. Farm equipment. We, in the United States and other MDCs, the farming is capital intensive, so there's a lot of equipment that is specially developed for certain crops, especially when you have monoculture and we are harvesting wheat or corn or such, that we have special farm equipment. And then just management practices, just the way it's we go about it. We have large factory farms that allow more efficiency and economies of scale. So you wouldn't think that overproduction of crops would be a bad thing, but it is when you are trying to sell your crops. So when you overproduce crops, but the demand remains the same, we really don't have a huge population growth in MDCs. It's pretty leveled off. So you don't have a lot more people needing the crops. So when the demand stays the same and the supply increases, with this supply-demand economic model, there's a surplus in products. So there's not as much demand as the supply. So when you have this high supply and a lower demand, this is going to cause the prices of the product to drop. So you have a lower price for the agriculture that you're trying to sell. And if you're not getting enough money for your product that you are raising, then you would go out of business. So there's a possibility that you wouldn't have enough money to continue farming. So because of this, the United States government has stepped in to subsidize farmers. When you subsidize, you're just giving money. It's not a loan. It's just like a gift, just kind of to help somebody out. So the government does this to make sure that farmers continue to grow food and so that they will continue to have the income that they need to continue growing. As you read about this, the United States government definitely subsidized agriculture, but compared to European governments, they actually subsidize a lot more. The subsidies go to commodity crops, and commodity crops are things that can be traded. Usually they are bought and sold on the stock market. There's about 20 commodity crops, and they're mostly grains. There's things that can last a long time. They won't spoil. The five, if I can remember, is wheat and corn, soybeans, and cotton, and the last one, I can't remember. Oh, rice, that's right. So these are commodity crops, and these are the things that are largely subsidized. So fruits and vegetables and such are not, and dairy are not subsidized by the government. A commodity chain is specifically looking at the links or the process of a product from its beginning to the end. And as we think about commodity change of something like chocolate, a chocolate candy bar, this doesn't always just happen now in maybe one country or one place. These commodity change can stretch across the world. So if we look at chocolate, a chocolate candy bar, it would start in a cocoa plantation in Africa. So here's Africa, part of Africa. So someplace in like Sierra Leone or Ivory Coast, somewhere in the west coast of Africa, right here. I can get my pen. And then, so it starts here where we have a cocoa plantation, and these are the cocoa pods right here. And then those cocoa beans would be harvested from the cocoa pods, and then here you see they are a collection here, in maybe a coastal port city in Africa. So you see bags of cocoa beans. And then those cocoa beans would make their way maybe to the UK or maybe over to the United States, and they would be processed in a cocoa processing plant making chocolate candy, so maybe like Cadbury or something. And then it would make its way to a candy store. So here we have this man who has different chocolates for sale at a candy store, and then somebody like this woman would come and buy a chocolate candy bar. So the commodity chain is from the beginning as like a cocoa plantation in Africa to the consumer. Kind of like the same idea as agribusiness. Alright, so I wanted to look a little bit about the Farm Bill and how it got started, that why governments, specifically the United States, subsidizes their farmers. And there is a great website that, as I was looking for information on this, that I will post on Edmodo with this, so you can look at that website. It has a more extended description of the Farm Bill, it was excellent. So in the 30s, 1933, there's this first act that was started. It was a precursor to the Farm Bill called the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And this was during the Great Depression, and farmers were actually growing a lot of crops, and there was just too many crops on the market, and so basically they weren't getting the money that they needed in selling their crops because there was too many. Caused a decrease in price. So the government bought up the excess grain and stored that away for later and paid farmers for that. Then 5 years later, 1938, the Farm Bill was actually established. And this was to subsidize these commodity crops. So the government would give money to farmers who grew corn and wheat, cotton and soybeans, and to help them make sure that they got the money that they needed to cover their costs because they were really growing too much. The government also would buy up the extra grain and store it to release it in the market when there was less of a supply, and thus controlling the price with the supply and demand. And the government would also tell the farmers how much land they should let fallow, they should set aside and not farm on. And in order for farmers to get their subsidies, they had to set land aside where they would not farm on it. So this would actually decrease the amount of crops that they would be able to harvest. Then 1996, this changed. This is the Freedom to Farm Act. The government decided that they were subsidizing farmers too much, and so they decided to kind of let the free market capitalism kind of control the grain prices, and they were going to phase out the subsidies. But they did make the farmers get crop insurance during this time because, to deal with the risk of maybe, having not, good prices because there was an overproduction, or maybe there being some kind of environmental drought that would cause them not to be able to produce. So get crop insurance, and then the United States actually subsidized that crop insurance. Well, this didn't really work out, and commodity prices started to fall. It was like 40% they fell because, again, of an overproduction of crops. And so because Congress was kind of afraid, they reinstated these direct payments to farmers. And the direct payments were actually regardless of the crops they were growing. It was tied to the value of the land. Since this Freedom to Farm Act, the United States pays a lot in money to subsidize farmers. Most recently, $20 billion a year. A lot for crop insurance, but also for direct payments. The criticism of the Farm Bill is that it's the wealthiest farmers that get most of the government subsidies. These are the large industrial farmers, or even just people who own farmland and don't even farm on it, they don't even live on it, but because the direct payments are related to the value of the farmland and not the crop grown on it, that these subsidies are going to people who don't need them. And the small farmers, small family farms, are not getting any of the subsidies. So 62%, you can see here, of farmers get nothing. And 10% of the wealthiest farmers get most of the money. So these subsidies are paid by taxpayers. And so with the Farm Bill up to be negotiated and passed, every 5 years they look at the Farm Bill again, and that's recently going on in the news. They're debating some of these issues. Subsidy receivers, like I said, are large agribusinesses. Those are the grain farmers, and small farmers don't get anything. And there is a global effect of this too. When you subsidize crops like commodity crops of wheat and corn and soybeans and such, and we are really function at a global level as far as buying and selling these commodity crops. So we're selling these crops, exporting these crops to other places in the world, or through food aid, giving these crops to other places in the world. Developing countries, less developed countries, can't compete with these lower grain prices. So at a global level, the United States helping our farmers reduces the overall prices of these crops and puts other farmers out of business and LDCs. So that hurts their livelihood. All right, so looking at the 1980s U.S. farm crisis, which was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression for farmers, their rural communities, and agribusiness. And this does relate to the Farm Bill. I'm going to kind of go through this. If you, you can look at this on your own, but I kind of go through it a little bit quickly. You can read through this a little bit more, but and there's a lot more involved in this. And actually, when you look at this crisis, it reflects other types of financial crises in the United States. The tech crisis in the 1990 tech bubble, the housing crisis in the early 2000s. So it's not something brand new, but some of these same patterns happen in any kind of financial crisis. So post-World War II, right, so the kind of 1950s, the United States had a really strong dollar. It was valued very high, and because of this, people couldn't buy products from the United States. So the United States was importing more products. They were buying things more from other countries than they were able to export. So this was a imbalanced trade. United States usually, or countries usually, like to sell more than they buy. And so because of that, the United States they adopted this flexible exchange rate, so that the value of the dollar would be determined by kind of supply and demand, free market for the global economy. And so the value of the dollar actually went down. At the same time, there were a lot of tax incentives to buy up, to invest in things like land and stocks and businesses. So because of this increase in the ability to export, because of the value of the dollar went down, and then more people were able to afford things in the United States, and this tax incentives to buy up land, farmers then went ahead and they bought up a lot of land. They invested in more machinery, and there was this huge farmland boom. Banks loaned money at really low interest rates. So you had a lot of farmers buying up a lot of land, a lot of machinery, so they could grow more crops to sell to this growing high demand of crops, especially like wheat. So during this time, like in the 70s, you had this improved China-United States relationship, and this is before China's one-child policy, so they were growing rapidly, population-wise, so they had a need to buy wheat. Crop failures in the Soviet Union, they had a need to grow wheat because they usually, grew wheat for themselves. And then you've got this growing population in developing nations, really starting in the 1950s with what we've talked about with the medical revolution. So there's this huge demand for wheat, and the USDA was ready to deliver on that. So and when you look at this, grain exports doubled between 1970 and 1973. It's only 3 years. And in that same time, income for U.S. farmers also doubled. And the value of their farmland increased by 73% in some places. So farmers were seeing that there was a lot of money to be made by buying up land, growing wheat, and selling it not only to our country but to the global market. So you have this increase in farmland, and so they were buying more and more. They were going more and more in debt, but banks were loaning money to them because they saw that this was just they could make money too. So you have more farmers growing more grain with a growing demand, and so with this supply a lot higher than the demand, you see now the prices starting to level off, in fact, decline. But because the land value was still very valuable, farmers didn't see that there was any problem with this. They still saw that their land was safe to invest, and there was a little bit of a cash flow problem because they weren't getting as much money for their grain as they were. So they refinanced their farmland to get more money and basically, get into more debt with these loans. And at this time, agriculture experts were saying, hey, this is the wave of the future. You either get big or you get out, increase in these capital-intensive, huge factory farms were a lot more efficient. Small family farms were declining, going out of business, not able to compete. And they're just getting big. Ronald Reagan as a president also, the monetary policy also encouraged with tax cuts and stuff, more spending. So what happened? With even the supply side of Ronald Reagan's monetary policy, the dollar increased in value. It got more, valuable. And so what happened? What was before, when the value of the dollar was too high, then exports dropped because people in other countries couldn't purchase these products because now became too expensive. So there was a loss of exports because of this decrease in demand, but people were continuing to grow a lot of products. Prices fell. They plummeted, up 64% drop in price in just corn. So the land values began to plummet. They lost their values. Farmers couldn't pay their mortgage payments because they had basically all this corn. They couldn't sell it at the price they were before. Banks refused to refinance their loans, which they were doing before. Because the farmers couldn't pay the payments, the banks collapsed, and there's this total collapse. Almost like, like the housing bubble, which we saw not too long ago. There was a multiplier effect. It not only hurt farmers who were losing their farms, it was also hurting the rural communities that depended on the income of these farmers. It hurt agribusiness. So anything that was connected to these farms was hurt financially. The government monetary policy changed to help the farmers out. They didn't want to see farmers stop being farmers, so you had these direct payments that started with the Food Security Act of 1985. Government was paying for up to 1/3 of a farmer's income. And the interesting question in the article that I read was, why didn't anybody see this coming? And at least the reason for this article that I read is that economists at that time, especially during this time, they were analyzing economics from mathematical models, complicated mathematical models, and they were ignoring what was really, really happening, kind of what they said is the relevant but non-quantifiable variables. What was happening on the ground? What were they actually seeing happen? So because of this farm crisis, a lot of farmers got out of the farming business. And so consequently, we have a lot more large agribusiness, large corporations, multinational corporations that are in farming in the United States, which have a huge influence on farm policy at the government level. All right, we're going to scale back and look at the rest of the little section of the chapter, which was sustainable agriculture. And sustainable agriculture is often called organic farming too. It is becoming a lot more popular as people are seeing the value of organic farming, sustainable use of our environment, healthier for environment, healthier for people. And so what is sustainable agriculture? It is basically using the environment in a sustainable way that you are not destroying it beyond what the land can handle. It's like not pushing the carrying capacity of the land. So it's you might not get as much money from organic farming overall, but it's there's not as much money put into it. You're not spending lots of money on machinery, on fertilizers. It's a lot more labor intensive. You might not get as much profit because of the labor intensive. And usually it's, there are some larger scale organic farming, but it's more small scale, more labor intensive. It's not using chemicals. It is integrating crops and animals, because of that mix of crops and animals is actually much better for the environment. It includes sensitive land management practices, such as the ridge tillage. You want to maintain the fertility and health of the soil, which ridge tillage does that. And so just, sensitive land management, lack of chemicals, and integrating the crops and animals. It's all better for the environment, better for people's health, and so this is just a couple pictures. You can see these rows here. I have ridge tillage. These are ridge tillage. Maybe something that you would typically see. Typical farming. This is all ridge tillage, and you don't plow it a lot. You try to maintain, not disturb the soil too much because it maintains the healthiness of the soil. Integrating the crops and the animals. The animals will fertilize the land, and that helps to maintain the healthy soil too. All right, so that's the end.